So all this was really to give a bit of context for how Maria and I had begun to wonder whether we could organise these seminar series as a kind of long or slow conference rather than a set of individual seminars. So we'd already started thinking about this, and then COVID happened. So our seminars had been suspended and we were going to have to do it online. And so over the summer, we started to think about what are we going to do with the seminar this year and who should we invite. So this actually opened up the possibility of thinking maybe we could invite a kind of different range of speakers to normal, and use the virtual possibilities of this departmental seminar to start a different kind of scholarly conversation. So people didn't just come for a one-off talk, but we might be able to create a bit more of a community between our students and the people who we were inviting to the seminar, and to run it as a bit more of a hybrid of a kind of conference, workshop, research project conversation. And that's what we've tried to do. So in the chat, we've put a link to the conference, the seminar series website, which is material.city, a nice neat URL that Maria organised for us. And we're collating materials related to this seminar series on that website. So we've decided to stick with one topic that's something that interests both of us over 4 weeks. And we've got speakers from ourselves from the UK, 2 from the United States and 1 from Australia. And our hope is that maybe we'll be able to invite some other people from the Global South or from other contexts next term as well, and continue this. And our hope is maybe to end in this, or at some point have a kind of round table where we can invite some of you, if you're interested in the topic, to participate in this conversation. So to this end, today's seminar is really an introduction to the theme that we came up with, which is the city as environmental mediation. And today we're going to really spend our time by giving you a bit of context for where that theme came from and why we think that it's interesting for material culture studies to be thinking about questions of mediation, how that helps us engage with issues to do with environmental change, and how that's playing out in our research in urban environments. And we're really inviting you to think with us about these topics, because they're topics that we're still very much kind of unpacking and thinking about in our work. So I'm going to just share the screen so I can tell you who the speakers are for the next seminars. Can you see the screen? Good. Okay, so this is our website. So we had our annual lecture, which was the first one, and we're talking this week. So next week we've got a seminar by Gotso Gunal. I don't know if I've pronounced that right, so apologies to her. And her paper is called Leapfrogging to Solar. And Maria is going to explain how you can access the paper in advance of the seminar. And she's going to talk to us for about 20 minutes about giving a bit of background to the paper and about her work. And then we're going to open up to questions. Then on the 26th of October, we've got an early seminar at 9 o'clock in the morning, because our speaker is from Australia. So she's Tess Lee, and she's going to be presenting a paper called Decolonising Trauma Theory by Way of Housing Disrepair, the case of Santa Teresa in Australia. And Tess Lee works on the interface between policy and Indigenous politics and Indigenous housing, and is doing some very interesting work in that area. And then our final speaker, just before reading week, is Shannon Matten from the New School in New York. And she's going to be giving a paper all about the cultural history of plexiglass. So we've got a nice range of papers on different topics, and these are speakers that both Maria and I have been engaging with, but haven't necessarily had the opportunity to talk to. So we're really looking forward to welcoming them to this seminar series. Okay. So just to run through how we're going to run this. So first of all, Maria and I are going to speak today for about 10 minutes each about how we have been thinking about the idea of the city as environmental mediation, and how that ties into concerns and preoccupations that we see as kind of important and relevant within material culture studies at the moment. And then we're going to then get you into groups. So we'll have a group discussion in the seminar room and a group discussion online. Maria will lead the discussion in the seminar room, and I'll lead the discussion online. And we're going to pose some questions to get you to think about how this helps you engage with material culture studies and what it might be for. And then we'll come back, we'll summarize that discussion, and then there'll be a general chance to pose some questions to us and the rest of the material group, culture group about what's being presented and about the seminar series as a whole. Okay, so that's my introduction, and now I'm going to hand over to Maria, who's going to talk about how this relates to her research.
Hi everyone, can you all hear me? Perfect. I magically appeared back in my office, and I will go back to the seminar room after this brief presentation. I prepared a PowerPoint because I want to take you on a walk through the city that I study in the northeast of Romania, called Piatra Neamț. Let's see, the slides are now loading. Perfect, it is opening. Can you see the slides? Perfect. Now, I was drawn in the conversation with Hannah to the idea of the city as environmental mediation because of this particular attention to the material dimensions of urban environment that indeed can tell us more about material politics and the material culture of everyday life. So I just want to start by telling you a little bit about what draws me towards the idea of the city of environmental mediation as a kind of, let's say, concrete and specific frame in which to study, let's say, rather abstract issues such as climate change, which can impact people's lives profoundly, but in very subtle ways. So as researchers, we can kind of, let's say, cut the network in a Straternian way and kind of use that methodologically to situate ourselves in a very strategic point through which to study everyday life. So in my case, for instance, it was a particular building. It was a particular block of flats. And in order to understand larger societal issues I was interested in, I placed myself there I studied this building for a year in a way with a dual purpose. On the one hand, to understand how people make sense of the environment and what impacts on the practices of, let's say, energy consumption and their everyday life, but also to see how they engage with institutions that carry out climate change mitigation projects, such as the City Hall, that I will tell you a little bit about. So I see the contribution of the city as environmental mediation at three levels. At the level of governance, at a conceptual level, and then at an experiential level, let's say. So I will briefly walk through these three levels that I've chosen. And I start with governance because actually my work started off as a critique of EU climate change mitigation schemes that impacted on building rehabilitation in Romania. So I will show you a couple of images. Like I said, I want to take you with me through Piatra Neamț in the northeast of Romania, and I will show you an image taken, let's say, towards the late 1990s and compare it to an image that I then took in 2012. And as you go back and forth between these two images, the most striking feature, apart from small things like windows and attics, is this layer of thermal insulation. And this was the thing that drew my attention towards a very specific type of material transformation in the city. These buildings quickly erected in quick succession around the 1970s were made for a huge influx of workers for the local industry. Middle-sized Romanian cities increased incredibly rapidly, and these buildings were not made necessarily with a specific eye to energy efficiency, as it was not such an issue at the time, but in time, as they degraded, especially as they aged, the bills were going up and people were very worried about the small means that they had in order to maintain the heat in their home. So a policy like a European one called EU 2020 that basically facilitated the layering of this polystyrene. It's a petrol derivative quite similar to what is used in the Grenfell Tower, for instance, that very efficiently, let's say, would insulate, but that has its own issues. That became incredibly popular. And what made me curious about this was how a policy that has very good intentions ends up as it trickles down, let's say at the level of the government and then at the level of everyday life, it actually has negative impacts. So for instance, here you can see this on that particular floor, I think it's on the 4th floor, that there is one missing. And that's how the city looked like in principle in many Romanian cities, and in fact not only Romanian. This is to a certain extent present in places like Hungary, like Bulgaria. You'll see this kind of puzzle of color and texture. It kind of becomes a map either of emigration, someone simply was not there, or of lack of social means. So Adam is saying that he feels like he's in the Carpathian Mountains. It's a very similar site to Suceava, where he did his research. So by talking to a block administrator, who then some of you might know became the main character in my documentary, Mr. Bud, I got to understand a little bit of the work that gets put into the repair and maintenance of these buildings, but also most importantly, that transforms, let's say, the city from the inside out through people's needs for heat and for a comfortable, safe home, let's say. So if you want, it can be by positioning oneself in one building, it can be a way of looking at larger, more abstract policies, let's say interstate policies, but seeing what happens, let's say, at the reception end of the policy. And in this case, seeing what individual people do with the tools they have, such as Mr. Booth. And this is the building this is the building I studied in particular. This is a building that he insulated himself, not so much with EU funding, but because he couldn't access it, but through kind of limited means of limited material means and a lot of will, if you want. But so this is at the let's say at the level of governance, but at the conceptual level, I also find it important to look at these buildings as a site of continual transformation, and to see them in the phrase built environment, to focus more on the environment part, also on the built part, but that's a more obvious one. But to see how they are transformed by elements of weather, and also how people, like I said earlier in relationship to Mr. Bud, have very clear techniques and methods to kind of fight against entropy through this repair and maintenance. And here you see one of the constructors of a construction firm that I followed putting the layer of polystyrene. So I looked very carefully at all the layers and how it is done in a kind of chaîne opératoire approach, if you want, really following each step and trying to describe in detail what materials were being used and how it was being done. But also working with a local architect, Adela Iacoban, for instance, starting from this image and seeing this as a kind of fixed image in time and in space, trying to understand the social biography of the building, if you want, and of the materials from the time in which it was made, in this case in the late 70s. And then slowly, as you can see here in some of the balconies, there's a layer of insulation, of insulation that gets added already from the 80s. The balconies are closing. There's a kind of degradation of the weather, of the rain, of the sun that comes in, as I said, with buildings being part of the larger environment, an attic that gets added, and later, towards the present day, all these layers of insulation that are added as a kind of undesired consequence of this EU policy that popularized the insulation per se, but did not necessarily make it accessible for everybody. So this is where we are. And I find that very important, actually, because it kind of allows us to ask really fruitful questions about the boundaries of a building, where a building ends and where it begins, but also at the processes that kind of keep together a building or pull it apart, both in terms of the relationship with the environment, but also, like I said, in terms of the communities that put a great deal of effort into keeping these buildings together in a productive way. So in this, what I notice is that in their everyday lives, people are very much aware of these, of the rain, of the steam. A simple gesture like making a cup of tea will have an effect on the level of humidity in the building that can further degrade it. There's a very kind of subtle knowledge that people will have. And this is how I get to the last bit, which is the, let's say, the more experiential level, the level of, like I said, of everyday life, of the laundry, of the gardens in between the blocks of flats, the little decorations that people will put in between the blocks of flats, the vines that provide them with grapes, and in the cellar of the blocks of flats they will make the wine. And here, this looks like an image of a cat. and actually a cat that looks a lot like mine, but it is not. It is mostly an image of these PET bottles that cover the plants around the cat. There's a specific kind of knowledge and engagement with the surrounding area of a block of flats that actually comes, and this is my final image, from having lived in the city even before these blocks of flats were made. A specific kind of environmental knowledge that stems from having lived in vernacular housing that was made with a very great attention to topology, to the winds, to what makes a comfortable home in a very ecologically well-rounded manner. And there is a relationship between the house and the block that I think is kind of at the core of these transformations that I started with to begin with. So this is just a little snippet, just a little walk through Piatra Neamț to kind of explore these three layers that can provide us with, I think, quite a potentially useful way of looking at environmental mediation. That was it. That was my bit.
Thanks, Maria.
Thank you.
Okay, so now I'm also going to share. Okay. Let's see if this is going to work. Great. Are you seeing that as a full image? Great.
Yes.
Okay, so thanks, Maria. It's really fascinating to see how you use the materiality of the city almost like a methodology of mapping out social life and social relations. And Maria and I started talking about some of these issues because, like her, I was also really interested in how climate change comes to manifest in the city. But if Maria starts with the materials and the everyday life and the really close attention to this work that's done on buildings over time and these sort of palimpsestic histories that are located in buildings, as a digital anthropologist, that I think my interest in climate change and the way in which it manifested in the city started with models. So I started to be interested in climate change in the city after having been doing research with engineers. I previously had done research with engineers who were involved in road construction. And now I'd started to have some conversations with engineers who worked for a big engineering firm called Arup, who were really thinking about and preoccupied by the way in which climate change was going to change the city. And they were involved in developing all kinds of models about energy models about the city and trying to link those energy models to climate models. And so I became really interested in the question of how we could study this climate change as a topic of anthropological study, and particularly how we could study something kind of ethnographically and empirically when the phenomena that I was interested in looking at was really kind of very much contained in these models. So what became really apparent as I started to look at it was that the really kind of profound significance of climate change. So obviously we're seeing some effects of climate change now, but the thing that's really galvanizing people and making people feel worried is material relationships that are projected forward into the future and scaled on a global scale. So my interest was then that how is it that these models come to kind of materialize in ways that are amenable to ethnographic and anthropological attention? And I kind of resolved this, if you like, by studying the way in which these climate models manifested within a particular site of the city of Manchester. So I became really interested then in the ways in which in some circumstances climate models seem to lend themselves to kind of being very generative in terms of creating kind of new ways in which people were engaging the city as a form of environmental mediation. But in other senses, these climate models were often like really problematic in terms of there being a very much a kind of mismatch between the way in which these models determined and decided and described environmental processes and the way in which people situated in places experienced the city as a site of environmental relations. So one example of this came when I was shadowing a project that was based at the university, and it was a group of climate scientists who were involved in what they call climate change adaptation. So trying to think about how cities were going to change and adapt and become resilient to weather changes that were going to take place as a result of climate change. But this was an example of where this projection of a future climate didn't really do the work that it was intended to do. So one of the sites that this project was working with was commercial buildings in the city. And one of the things they tried to do was to take these global climate models, scaled down to the level of the city, and tried to scale them down even further to the level of the building. And they went and they did interviews with buildings managers, which I kind of participated in and shadowed, where they were trying to get the managers to be concerned about the future changes that they were going to face in the climate. So the modelers went to these meetings, or the people who were the spokespeople for the modelers went to these meetings, and they told the managers there's going to be like 2 to 4 degrees of warming in the city, and there's going to be greater precipitation, and there's going to be more wind, and what do you think about that? What are you going to make? What do you make of that? What are you going to do about it? But these kind of demands or requests to be concerned about these kind of projected effects of temperature changes were rather kind of undermined and diminished by the fact that the buildings managers who were located in these buildings didn't really see these kind of effects as being particularly drastic, because the buildings that they were working in already saw much greater temperature and climatic changes across the course of a day than the models were projecting as something that would happen in 50 years' time. So the people working in the building were saying, well, we've already got a problem where it's 8 degrees hotter on the south side of the building to the north side of the building, and we've been trying to struggle with like how to make sure that the receptionist who sits on the front desk by the revolving doors isn't so cold that they have to wear a fleece that doesn't look very professional. So really, like when you say there's going to be 2 degrees to 4 degrees of warming in 50 years' time, that seems pretty irrelevant to the kinds of preoccupations that we're having in the city. So this was kind of interesting in terms of the way in which you have this kind of interference between or tension between different modes of describing and engaging environmental mediation, and that this becomes the grounds upon which discussions and debates take place at a kind of political level between people who are differently positioned within the city around questions of environmental change. But the second example I want to talk about is where, oh sorry, I missed that one, is the example of where actually global climate models did have a capacity to generate alternative or new forms of envisioning the city as a site of environmental mediation. So, sorry, I've just lost my place. Okay, so one of the big challenges that had been identified in post-industrial cities like Manchester was the built-in contribution that to global carbon emissions that were going to be generated by the very fabric of the material of the majority of the city's housing stock. So global climate projections identify idea of a certain budget of carbon emissions that need to be reduced. And a lot of work had gone into scaling down these calculations of global carbon budgets to the level of the city. And what this demonstrated was that this new object of political concern had emerged in these calculations and in these models, which was this housing stock, the city's buildings. So I became really interested in how buildings were being transformed from sites which had been sort of objects of political attention because of the way in which they had different kinds of tenancy or different kind of socioeconomic factors into these entities that were newly being kind of engaged as environmental objects. So there were a whole range of activities that were happening in the city around buildings as kind of newly lively environmental objects. So thermographic cameras and energy monitors had been bought by various publicly funded projects and were being housed in city libraries for people to rent out so that they could attune themselves to the thermal properties of their buildings. The city council had gained funding for a demonstration eco house, and they'd transformed one of the houses in their housing kind of portfolio into a kind of an energy show home, and we're inviting landlords and people to come and look at this house as a way of thinking about how they can make their homes more energy efficient. And there were many of these show homes that sprung up around the city. And then on the campus of Salford University, there was a pioneering kind of centre for the built environment, and they'd won a European funding grant to create an experimental eco house inside a physics chamber. And this house was a direct replica of a typical Manchester hard to heat home. And it was full of all kinds of kind of whole suite of monitoring tools, and based in this chamber that was capable of making it rain and making it snow, and they could change the temperature levels. And they even thought about whether or not they could get people to come and live in the house, but the health and safety regulations of the university didn't let people stay overnight on campus in this laboratory setting. It was an interesting case. So houses then were being rethought as these sites of environmental mediation. Householders were ripping walls out, insulation was being installed, ventilation put in, light wells embedded, low energy light bulbs were being screwed in. And as this happened, houses were being re-engaged as flows of energy. And people were articulating their engagement with people who were very involved in this process. Anyway, we're articulating their engagement with their house as a rethinking of environmental processes. So they've started to think about buying electric vehicles. People were talking about turning their heating down, installing solar panels, some becoming super users. Oh, sorry, I'm going to go there, for their energy company or trialing technologies. So the city then kind of refigured itself around the implications of these global climate models as they were kind of reworked and objectified in city buildings. So this, for me, was very productive in that seeing the city as an environmental mediation became a way of understanding and analysing the social and political effects of trying to scale climate models up and down from a global scale to a local scale. But by thinking of the city as an environmental mediation, it also seemed to offer the possibility of not having to choose as an anthropologist at which scale one's operating, but to be able to traverse these different scales empirically and ethnographically, showing how this produces kind of incommensurabilities in some circumstances and productive and new engagement with material processes in other circumstances. So yeah, so I think this kind of theme has been very generative for Maria and I in thinking about how does material culture studies engage with kind of global abstractions and modelled processes in a grounded and kind of socially sensitive way, but in a way that also doesn't dismiss and do away with the techniques of these models that themselves are traces of or propositions about traces of material processes. And I think this feels very generative for thinking beyond climate change to other kinds of abstractions and processes, like the way in which something like COVID, for example, is now being dealt with, and similarly kind of materialized in particular locations and particularly in urban settings. So that's really to kind of give a sense of where, oh, I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, where Maria and I are coming from and why we've chosen this as a topic, and why, and I think the broader framing of this is really trying to think about what does material culture studies have to offer to the study of the Anthropocene, which is a big topic at the moment. And we really want to kind of invite you to be part of that conversation and to think about how some of the things that we've been talking about might link to some of the things you might be interested in. So I think Maria's going to take over now.
Before I tell you about the question, I just had the biggest smile on my face when you described buildings as lively environmental objects. And I think, although at the very beginning of the talks you think, what do these two topics have in mind? I think it's actually really lovely to see that they deal at their core with essentially the same topic. Sometimes even at the topic of performance gap, of what the modelers versus the real people living in the real house kind of imagine as being a building or a well-functioning building. So thank you, that was really interesting. So I wrote down basically a breakdown of the topic that Hannah just introduced. So I suggest that first of all, I take a moment to come back into the seminar room, and we can take a small break and then discuss the following: some examples of environmental mediation, and we can explore together what is being mediated, how, for whom, and what questions and issues this might raise. And finally, how might material culture studies contribute to an understanding of global environmental change? And if we take, let's say, until 6 o'clock, is that good? For us in the room until 6 o'clock, and then we will mute the room so that you can have the discussion without us bothering you, and then we will join you at 6 o'clock so that we can exchange some thoughts. How does this sound? Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Maria.
Lovely. Then I'll see you. I will hang up now and I will go to the seminar.